KaraokeBooks.
Chapter 9. His wife returned late at night. She came in on tiptoe, but he heard her, opened his eyes, and made haste to close them again. She wished to send Gerasim away and to sit with him herself, but he opened his eyes and said, "No, go away. Are you in great pain? Always the same. Take some opium." He agreed and took some. She went away. Till about 3 in the morning he was in a state of stupefied misery. It seemed to him that he and his pain were being thrust into a narrow, deep black sack, but though they were pushed further and further in they could not be pushed to the bottom. And this, terrible enough in itself, was accompanied by suffering. He was frightened yet wanted to fall through the sack, he struggled but yet co-operated. And suddenly he broke through, fell, and regained consciousness. Gerasim was sitting at the foot of the bed dozing quietly and patiently, while he himself lay with his emaciated stockinged legs resting on Gerasim's shoulders. The same shaded candle was there and the same unceasing pain. "Go away, Gerasim," he whispered. "It's all right, sir. I'll stay a while." "No. Go away." He removed his legs from Gerasim's shoulders, turned sideways onto his arm, and felt sorry for himself. He only waited till Gerasim had gone into the next room and then restrained himself no longer but wept like a child. He wept on account of his helplessness, his terrible loneliness, the cruelty of man, the cruelty of God, and the absence of God. "Why hast thou done all this? Why hast thou brought me here? Why dost thou torment me so terribly?" He did not expect an answer and yet wept because there was no answer and could be none. The pain again grew more acute, but he did not stir and did not call. He said to himself, "Go on. Strike me. But what is it for? What have I done to thee? What is it for?" Then he grew quiet and not only ceased weeping but even held his breath and became all attention. It was as though he were listening not to an audible voice but to the voice of his soul, to the current of thoughts arising within him. "What is it you want?" was the first clear conception capable of expression in words, that he heard. "What do you want? What do you want?" he repeated to himself. "What do I want? To live and not to suffer," he answered. And again he listened with such concentrated attention that even his pain did not distract him. "To live? How?" asked his inner voice. "Why, to live as I used to, well and pleasantly." "As you lived before, well and pleasantly?" the voice repeated. And in imagination he began to recall the best moments of his pleasant life. But strange to say, none of those best moments of his pleasant life now seemed at all what they had then seemed, none of them except the first recollections of childhood. There, in childhood, there had been something really pleasant with which it would be possible to live if it could return. But the child who had experienced that happiness existed no longer, it was like a reminiscence of somebody else. As soon as the period began which had produced the present Ivan Ilyich, all that had then seemed joys now melted before his sight and turned into something trivial and often nasty. And the further he departed from childhood and the nearer he came to the present, the more worthless and doubtful were the joys. This began with the school of law. A little that was really good was still found there. There was light-heartedness, friendship, and hope. But in the upper classes there had already been fewer of such good moments. Then during the first years of his official career, when he was in the service of the governor, some pleasant moments again occurred. They were the memories of love for a woman. Then all became confused and there was still less of what was good. Later on again there was still less that was good, and the further he went the less there was. His marriage, a mere accident, then the disenchantment that followed it, his wife's bad breath and the sensuality and hypocrisy. Then that deadly official life and those preoccupations about money, a year of it, and 2, and 10, and 20, and always the same thing. and the longer it lasted the more deadly it became. It is as if I had been going downhill while I imagined I was going up. And that is really what it was. I was going up in public opinion, but to the same extent life was ebbing away from me. And now it is all done and there is only death. Then what does it mean? Why? It can't be that life is so senseless and horrible. But if it really has been so horrible and senseless, why must I die and die in agony? There is something wrong. Maybe I did not live as I ought to have done, it suddenly occurred to him. But how could that be, when I did everything properly? He replied, and immediately dismissed from his mind this, the sole solution of all the riddles of life and death, as something quite impossible. Then what do you want now? To live? Live how? Live as you lived in the law courts when the usher proclaimed, "The judge is coming." The judge is coming, the judge, he repeated to himself. Here he is, the judge. But I am not guilty, he exclaimed angrily. What is it for? And he ceased crying, but turning his face to the wall continued to ponder on the same question. Why, and for what purpose, is there all this horror? But however much he pondered he found no answer. And whenever the thought occurred to him, as it often did, that it all resulted from his not having lived as he ought to have done, he at once recalled the correctness of his whole life and dismissed so strange an idea.
KaraokeBooks.
Chapter 10. Another fortnight passed. Ivan Ilyich now no longer left his sofa. He would not lie in bed but lay on the sofa, facing the wall nearly all the time. He suffered ever the same unceasing agonies and in his loneliness pondered always on the same insoluble question. What is this? Can it be that it is death? And the inner voice answered, yes, it is death. Why these sufferings? And the voice answered, for no reason, they just are so. Beyond and besides this there was nothing. From the very beginning of his illness, ever since he had first been to see the doctor, Ivan Ilyich's life had been divided between two contrary and alternating moods. Now it was despair and the expectation of this uncomprehended and terrible death, and now hope and an intently interested observation of the functioning of his organs. Now before his eyes there was only a kidney or an intestine that temporarily evaded its duty, and now only that incomprehensible and dreadful death from which it was impossible to escape. These two states of mind had alternated from the very beginning of his illness, but the further it progressed the more doubtful and fantastic became the conception of the kidney, and the more real the sense of impending death. He had but to call to mind what he had been 3 months before and what he was now, to call to mind with what regularity he had been going downhill, for every possibility of hope to be shattered. Latterly, during the loneliness in which he found himself as he lay facing the back of the sofa, a loneliness in the midst of a populous town and surrounded by numerous acquaintances and relations, but that yet could not have been more complete anywhere, either at the bottom of the sea or under the earth. During that terrible loneliness Ivan Ilyich had lived only in memories of the past. Pictures of his past rose before him one after another. They always began with what was nearest in time and then went back to what was most remote, to his childhood, and rested there. If he thought of the stewed prunes that had been offered him that day, his mind went back to the raw shriveled French plums of his childhood, their peculiar flavor and the flow of saliva when he sucked their stones, and along with the memory of that taste came a whole series of memories of those days. His nurse, his brother, and their toys. No, I mustn't think of that. It is too painful, Ivan Ilyich said to himself, and brought himself back to the present, to the button on the back of the sofa and the creases in its morocco. Morocco is expensive, but it does not wear well. There had been a quarrel about it. It was a different kind of quarrel and a different kind of morocco that time when we tore father's portfolio and were punished, and Mama brought us some tarts. And again his thoughts dwelt on his childhood, And again it was painful and he tried to banish them and fix his mind on something else. Then again together with that chain of memories another series passed through his mind, of how his illness had progressed and grown worse. There also the further back he looked the more life there had been. There had been more of what was good in life and more of life itself. The two merged together. Just as the pain went on getting worse and worse, so my life grew worse and worse, he thought. There is one bright spot there at the back, at the beginning of life, and afterwards all becomes blacker and blacker and proceeds more and more rapidly, in inverse ratio to the square of the distance from death, thought Ivan Ilyich. And the example of a stone falling downwards with increasing velocity entered his mind. Life, a series of increasing sufferings, flies further and further towards its end, the most terrible suffering. I am flying. He shuddered, shifted himself, and tried to resist, but was already aware that resistance was impossible. And again with eyes weary of gazing but unable to cease seeing what was before them, he stared at the back of the sofa and waited, awaiting that dreadful fall and shock and destruction. Resistance is impossible, he said to himself. If I could only understand what it is all for. But that too is impossible. An explanation would be possible if it could be said that I have not lived as I ought to. But it is impossible to say that, and he remembered all the legality, correctitude, and propriety of his life. That at any rate can certainly not be admitted, he thought, and his lips smiled ironically as if someone could see that smile and be taken in by it. There is no explanation. Agony, death. What for?
KaraokeBooks.
Chapter 11. Another 2 weeks went by in this way, and during that fortnight an event occurred that Ivan Ilyich and his wife had desired. Petrushev formally proposed. It happened in the evening. The next day Prasovya Fedorovna came into her husband's room considering how best to inform him of it, but that very night there had been a fresh change for the worse in his condition. She found him still lying on the sofa but in a different position. He lay on his back, groaning and staring fixedly straight in front of him. She began to remind him of his medicines, but he turned his eyes towards her with such a look that she did not finish what she was saying. So great an animosity, to her in particular, did that look express. "For Christ's sake let me die in peace," he said. She would have gone away, but just then their daughter came in and went up to say good morning. He looked at her as he had done at his wife, and in reply to her inquiry about his health said dryly that he would soon free them all of himself. They were both silent and after sitting with him for a while went away. "Is it our fault?" Lisa said to her mother. "It's as if we were to blame. I am sorry for Papa, but why should we be tortured?" The doctor came at his usual time. Ivan Ilyich answered, yes, and no, never taking his angry eyes from him, and at last said, "You know you can do nothing for me, so leave me alone. We can ease your sufferings. You can't even do that. Let me be." The doctor went into the drawing room and told Prasovya Fedorovna that the case was very serious and that the only resource left was opium to allay her husband's sufferings, which must be terrible. It was true, as the doctor said, that Ivan Ilyich's physical sufferings were terrible, but worse than the physical sufferings were his mental sufferings, which were his chief torture. His mental sufferings were due to the fact that that night, as he looked at Gerasim's sleepy, good-natured face with its prominent cheekbones, the question suddenly occurred to him. What if my whole life has been wrong? It occurred to him that what had appeared perfectly impossible before, namely that he had not spent his life as he should have done, might after all be true. It occurred to him that his scarcely perceptible attempts to struggle against what was considered good by the most highly placed people, those scarcely noticeable impulses which he had immediately suppressed, might have been the real thing, and all the rest false. And his professional duties and the whole arrangement of his life and of his family, and all his social and official interests, might all have been false. He tried to defend all those things to himself and suddenly felt the weakness of what he was defending. There was nothing to defend. But if that is so, he said to himself, and I am leaving this life with the consciousness that I have lost all that was given me and it is impossible to rectify it, what then? He lay on his back and began to pass his life in review in quite a new way. In the morning when he saw first his footman, then his wife, then his daughter, and then the doctor, their every word and movement confirmed to him the awful truth that had been revealed to him during the night. In them he saw himself, all that for which he had lived, and saw clearly that it was not real at all, but a terrible and huge deception which had hidden both life and death. This consciousness intensified his physical suffering tenfold. He groaned and tossed about, and pulled at his clothing which choked and stifled him. And he hated them on that account. He was given a large dose of opium and became unconscious, but at noon his sufferings began again. He drove everybody away and tossed from side to side. His wife came to him and said, "Jean, my dear, do this for me. It can't do any harm and often helps. Healthy people often do it." He opened his eyes wide. "What? Take communion? Why? It's unnecessary." However, she began to cry. "Yes, do, my dear. I'll send for our priest. He is such a nice man." "All right. Very well," he muttered. When the priest came and heard his confession, Ivan Ilyich was softened and seemed to feel a relief from his doubts and consequently from his sufferings, and for a moment there came a ray of hope. He again began to think of the vermiform appendix and the possibility of correcting it. He received the sacrament with tears in his eyes. When they laid him down again afterwards he felt a moment's ease, and the hope that he might live awoke in him again. He began to think of the operation that had been suggested to him. "To live. I want to live," he said to himself. His wife came in to congratulate him after his communion, and when uttering the usual conventional words she added, "You feel better, don't you?" Without looking at her he said, "Yes." Her dress, her figure, the expression of her face, the tone of her voice, all revealed the same thing. "This is wrong, it is not as it should be. All you have lived for and still live for is falsehood and deception, hiding life and death from you." And as soon as he admitted that thought, his hatred and his agonizing physical suffering again sprang up, and with that suffering a consciousness of the unavoidable, approaching end. And to this was added a new sensation of grinding shooting pain and a feeling of suffocation. The expression of his face when he uttered that "yes" was dreadful. Having uttered it, he looked her straight in the eyes, turned on his face with a rapidity extraordinary in his weak state and shouted, "Go away! Go away and leave me alone!"
KaraokeBooks.
Chapter 12. From that moment the screaming began that continued for 3 days, and was so terrible that one could not hear it through 2 closed doors without horror. At the moment he answered his wife he realized that he was lost, that there was no return, that the end had come, the very end, and his doubts were still unsolved and remained doubts. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" he cried in various intonations. He had begun by screaming, "I won't," and continued screaming on the letter O. For 3 whole days, during which time did not exist for him, he struggled in that black sack into which he was being thrust by an invisible, resistless force. He struggled as a man condemned to death struggles in the hands of the executioner, knowing that he cannot save himself. And every moment he felt that despite all his efforts he was drawing nearer and nearer to what terrified him. He felt that his agony was due to his being thrust into that black hole and still more to his not being able to get right into it. He was hindered from getting into it by his conviction that his life had been a good one. That very justification of his life held him fast and prevented his moving forward, and it caused him most torment of all. Suddenly some force struck him in the chest and side, making it still harder to breathe, and he fell through the hole, and there at the bottom was a light. What had happened to him was like the sensation one sometimes experiences in a railway carriage when one thinks one is going backwards while one is really going forwards and suddenly becomes aware of the real direction. Yes, it was not the right thing, he said to himself, but that's no matter. It can be done. But what is the right thing? He asked himself, and suddenly grew quiet. This occurred at the end of the third day, 2 hours before his death. Just then his schoolboy son had crept softly in and gone up to the bedside. The dying man was still screaming desperately and waving his arms. His hand fell on the boy's head, and the boy caught it, pressed it to his lips, and began to cry. At that very moment Ivan Ilyich fell through and caught sight of the light, and it was revealed to him that though his life had not been what it should have been, this could still be rectified. He asked himself, "What is the right thing?" and grew still, listening. Then he felt that someone was kissing his hand. He opened his eyes, looked at his son, and felt sorry for him. His wife came up to him and he glanced at her. She was gazing at him open-mouthed, with undried tears on her nose and cheek and a despairing look on her face. He felt sorry for her too. "Yes, I am making them wretched," he thought. "They are sorry, but it will be better for them when I die." He wished to say this but had not the strength to utter it. Besides, why speak? I must act, he thought. With a look at his wife, he indicated his son and said, "Take him away. Sorry for him. Sorry for you too." He tried to add, "Forgive me," but said, "Forgo," and waved his hand, knowing that he whose understanding mattered would understand. And suddenly it grew clear to him that what had been oppressing him and would not leave him was all dropping away at once from 2 sides, from 10 sides, and from all sides. He was sorry for them. He must act so as not to hurt them, release them and free himself from these sufferings. How good and how simple, he thought. And the pain? He asked himself. What has become of it? Where are you, pain? He turned his attention to it. Yes, here it is. Well, what of it? Let the pain be. And death? Where is it? He sought his former accustomed fear of death and did not find it. Where is it? What death? There was no fear because there was no death. In place of death there was light. So that's what it is, he suddenly exclaimed aloud. What joy! To him all this happened in a single instant, and the meaning of that instant did not change. For those present his agony continued for another 2 hours. Something rattled in his throat, his emaciated body twitched. Then the gasping and rattle became less and less frequent. "It is finished," said someone near him. He heard these words and repeated them in his soul. "Death is finished," he said to himself. "It is no more." He drew in a breath, stopped in the midst of a sigh, stretched out, and died.
KaraokeBooks.